Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Harshit Kukreja, and today as my guest I have Shambhavi, who's head of our research program, and Shri, who is our in-house lawyer and is our content manager. Hi Shambhavi, hi Shri, how are you guys?
Hey Harshit, I'm
Hi,
good.
Ash. I'm doing
So,
well.
yeah, hi. So a few weeks ago, somewhere in August, there was a judgment related to the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Amendment Act 2021. We'll talk about the judgment today. It has some implications in policy and it seems like a very forward looking act. So previously what happened, according to the 1971, the original act, there were certain thresholds in which you could get an abortion, and usually it was divided up to 12 weeks and 12 to 20 weeks. Up to 12 weeks, an opinion of one doctor was required, and 12 to 20 weeks, an opinion of two doctors were required. And there were certain categories, for instance, if there were serious fetal abnormalities, if the mother suffered from grievous injuries, or her health was at risk, or she had some mental conditions, there was some kind of mental retardation, and so on and so forth. In 2021, the parliament amended the law and increased the age from 20 to 24 and made some amendment and made some changes to the rules. Now, in August, the Supreme Court passed a judgment which had some interesting and forward looking implications. So, Shambhavi, would you like to tell us about that?
Sure, let me just set the context a bit more than just let me add to what you've just said, Harshit. So this year has been quite interesting, I think, for women's rights. First, we had in the US Roe v. Wade, which was overturned, and that kind of led to an entire conversation on women's autonomy when figuring out decisions about their own body and how much should the society actually intervene in those. Then we had discussion about whether marital rape is a form of rape, should that be criminalized, etc. here in India. And on the backdrop of that, there have been these ongoing conversations about how, even though India's laws on abortion have been progressive as compared to what we have seen in the US and other countries, is the situation on the ground actually permitting women to access safe abortions? And how do we change that? Right? How do we change that aspect, the social aspects? Is the Indian society more permissive for women to access abortions, particularly if they're not married or if the spouse is not around? Can women actually take those kind of decisions on their own? Right? And the backdrop of this judgment, I think, is quite refreshing. So, what has happened in this case is that there is an unmarried woman who had filed a case for abortion because her partner had refused to marry her. So, she wanted to abort her 23-week fetus, and the hospitals had refused abortion, saying you're not permitted under the law because there is a aspect of the Amendment Act, Clause 3B, which categorizes women who can access safe abortions after 20 weeks of gestation. And the hospital said that you don't fall into this category. So the case was filed, and what the judgment actually read was that we cannot and should not be differentiating women on their marital status because there's a constitutional right to equality. Because of that, the woman should be permitted to have access to safe abortions. The judgment then went on to say that for this particular Medical Termination Pregnancy Act, even marital rape should be counted as rape, and if a woman wants to abort, the fetus should be allowed to. And that woman in this case is not just a cis heterosexual woman, but is anybody who can carry a fetus and a baby to term. So I think in terms of all of those, this was quite a refreshing judgment. It was quite a futuristic judgment. And I think the judgment should be able to set off now social conversations around what needs to change. It should be able to arm women with some sort of validation that they can have autonomy over their own bodies, and that going now to the doctor should create more safe spaces. Actually, I'm actually quite excited to hear from you what you think with your law background on how this judgment might set precedent for future cases.
Sure. Thanks, Harshit. Thanks, Shambhavi, for having me here. So, at the outset, since you mentioned the overall global debate over abortion rights, which is intensified thanks to overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States, and how a lot of commentators compared that to India and said that India has comparably progressive legal regime for abortion. This assumption at the outset I would like to challenge, because if you look at how the legal text is today with regards to abortion, causing a miscarriage is actually an offense under the Indian Penal Code. So section 312 says that whoever voluntarily causes a woman with a child to miscarry, if not done with a good faith for the purpose of saving the life of the woman, is punishable with imprisonment, right? And this includes the woman herself. If a woman who causes herself to miscarry is covered within section 312 of IPC.
Hey, Shri, sorry,
So
question
the
on
rule
that.
is,
Shri, sorry. Is there a
yes,
so when you say miscarry, it can be at any stage since the woman found out she's pregnant?
yes.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry.
So this does not make any distinction or categorization in terms of the number of weeks which we find in MTP, which is what I was coming to, right? So the general rule is that abortion is a punishable offense. However, MTP is a special law which carves out an exception to the offense under IPC. And MTP says that MTP, which was passed in 1971, says that if certain conditions given under the law is satisfied and abortion is carried out by a registered medical practitioner, then this is not a criminal offense. So, in that sense, there is no generalized legal right to abortion as such. Now, whether this is a constitutional issue, if there is a right to reproductive justice which covers a right to abortion, that's a separate issue. But as far as the legal regime is concerned, this is the position. Now, as Harshit rightly mentioned at the beginning, and I think the judgment we are talking about also makes note of this fact, is that there are two categories of women who can undergo abortion, right? So, one is up to 20 weeks, and the second is a special category of women between 20 to 24 weeks. Now, again, there is no right to free abortion. Why do I say that? Because this abortion under both these categories can be availed by a woman only if the doctor is of the opinion that continuance of the pregnancy will cause a risk to the life of the woman, physical or mental injury to the woman, or there is a risk to the child if it were born, right? So there is no general right to abortion as such. Only if these conditions are met can you undergo abortion. Now, coming to the judgment itself, right? So, what did it pertain to? So, the woman in question here was choosing to avail abortion after 23 weeks, as Shambhavi pointed out, and she was trying to avail it under the special category, right? So, I'll quickly read out the 7 categories which are covered under Rule 3B of the MTP rules. So, first is survivors of sexual assault, second is minors, third is change of marital status during the ongoing pregnancy, fourth is women with physical disabilities, fifth is mentally ill women, sixth is if there is any fetal malformation, and lastly, women with pregnancy in humanitarian settings or disaster or emergency situations. So this women, in as regards this judgment, was claiming under clause C, which is the third one, change of marital status during the ongoing pregnancy. Clearly, she was an unmarried woman. So the question before the court was, whether she is entitled to seek abortion under this particular provision. The court, of course, as you rightly pointed out, Shambhavi, gave a very expansive meaning to marital status. It said that, what this clause actually contemplates is a change in material circumstances. So since in this situation, the partner had refused to marry her, she, of course, did not want to carry the pregnancy. So the court said that, discriminating between married and unmarried women in this sense is wrong because it violates your right to equality under Article 14, and said that clause C has to be read very generally to include all women, and you cannot discriminate between married and unmarried women. So this judgment, in fact, is very welcome. It is progressive in this sense. And in fact, this is not new because I think unmarried women have been getting some form of legal protection right from Maternity Benefit Act, Succession Act, Adoption Act. All these laws have recognized that even unmarried women can have legal rights, and marriage is not the sole institution which gives you all such rights. So in that sense, yes, it is progressive. And of course, there is also a lot of traction regarding the marital rape issue, right? But at least in my opinion, the court made an observation, yes, that for the purpose of getting aborted, marital rape is considered rape for the purpose of MTP Act alone and not under IPC. But my contention with that is this was not exactly the issue before the court. So this might be considered as an observation and it has a persuasive value for sure. It is the right kind of signaling coming from the Apex Court. But however, I'm not very sure about how this is going to play out and whether at all this can be treated as a precedent. So I would like to stop here and invite both of you to sort of
Actually, I
So
have a follow-up question. So, for example, this morning after pill, etc., should are they not allowed then? How does that work if miscarriage is
I
really?
think they come under the contraceptive failure sort of section, and that is allowed till 20 weeks, I suppose. So there's one more
Hmm.
section which allows you to undergo abortion if
If you can,
you can, yeah, contraceptive failure. That's a category. I just wanted to ask
yeah.
that because I think that is 20 weeks. You can use that as a reason. After 20 weeks, there are specific categories which you have to avail the services of an RMP and so on and so forth. But you can use that. But even though till 2021 or 2003, there were also new rules. But even after that, even after I think this new judgment, access to abortion will be a tough thing for women to navigate because there are a lot of social biases. Doctors, even in urban centers, even in elite urban hospitals, want the spouse or the husband or someone to come in and sign because they also have their biases. They live in that same society, and then they also fear repercussion from the family of the women. And a lot of them are not very familiar with all the aspects of the MTP law. So even after this very welcome judgment, I still feel that abortion would still remain a hindrance. Right, access to abortion will still remain a hindrance to a lot of women in the country.
No, I think you're right, Harshit. And in fact, the court in this judgment is alive to this reality, right? And in fact, the court also notes that this hesitance or reluctance on part of doctors to carry out abortion procedure might come from the fact that if all the conditions under MTP Act is not followed, then you can be held liable, right? There is a fear of prosecution in case they end up performing abortion procedure in a situation where they're not supposed to. So I think by abundance cautions, doctors also tend to go overboard, right? And they ask women to get consent from their family, for instance, or ask them to get judicial authorization. And in this particular judgment, the Supreme Court comes down strongly on these extra legal requirements, as the court calls it, and says that they have no basis in law. And it makes it very clear that women's consent or her guardian's consent, if she's a minor, is the only material consent which is required. And the doctors, in fact, have been cautioned not to impose these extra legal requirements on women who are seeking termination of their pregnancy. Because the unintended consequences of this is also that, in case you're not able to follow all these formalities of law, then you end up accessing unsafe abortion from, dodgy doctors. So yes,
Yeah,
your concerns are very valid, but I think the court at least has pushed the doctors to sort of not impose these kind of requirements.
I think the court in their judgment also mentioned that somewhere around, I think they were quoting the British Medical Journal or some medical journal. They said somewhere around 65 to 70% of abortions are unsafe. So they want to shift that users into the safe category because unsafe abortions can lead to a lot of adverse consequences and a lot of they can also be fatal. You can have infections, sepsis, you can have severe diseases and disorders. So, yeah, there's also a practical aspect attached to this, and it would be
Precisely. In fact, I was just reading upon this when I found out that, lack of access to safe abortion is the third leading cause of maternal mortality in India. So, yes.
so, and there are also a lot of restrictions on who can perform these abortions. It's like an MBBS doctor trained in OBGY, there are certain degrees in which you can get. So that also limits the number of abortions, the number of places a person can go to. And there's one more thing you can get abnormalities scan at somewhere around 18 to 22 weeks. So by the time you get your scan, you make up your mind and then maybe your family doesn't agree because not always like 100% accurate. It's chances the baby may have certain abnormalities, may not have certain abnormalities, and maybe the abnormalities may not be as severe as proposed. So after that it should be the women's choice, should she want to carry the child to like age or not. But these rules, even the current judgment, I think the age of viability is somewhere around 28 weeks. So it would have been more prudent if the age would have been expanded to 28 weeks, and maybe after the consent of, I think it's till 2 RMPs you need somewhere around 24, and after 24 weeks you need some kind of judicial review or a board review.
Medical board review after 28 weeks.
Yeah.
Sorry, why did you say 28 weeks?
So somewhere around 24 to 28 weeks is considered the age of viability.
Oh, the
After
age of
28
viability,
weeks,
right?
the chances of survival of the fetus is 80-90% without serious adverse effects.
But with significant
So
medical intervention.
yeah, obviously. So this will not work in a low rural settings with no resources. But maybe they want to make a uniform law. So I think at least 20, it should have been till 28 without like significant hindrances. For instance, a woman gets a report at 23 weeks that her fetus may have significant abnormalities. So it takes time for you to digest the fact, talk to it about with your spouse, maybe with your family, and it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and then get
And
two
maybe
RMPs to get a few
yeah, and
opinions.
even yeah, even for instance, if you got a little late, if you didn't get your scan at 22, you got it at 23, or there are a lot of practical hindrances. And in public hospital, there's always a line and so on and so forth. So you can always be a little late. And it also is a big decision if you have carried the baby till 20 to 23 weeks. It is not an easy decision to abort it based on some probability that you cannot see and feel. The doctor is telling you your baby may have a 70% chance of XYZ abnormality. So
Yeah, and these are very practical problems, right? And I think the law contemplates it to some extent. It says this length of pregnancy restriction will not apply if, there is a termination which is necessitated by substantial fetal abnormalities. But again, this has to be diagnosed by a medical board. And this might take time. And this is again a bureaucratic hassle for a person. And I can't even imagine what the person must be going through at
Yeah,
this
I can't,
point, right? So,
I can't think of what a pregnant woman who was, I mean, for somehow come to that conclusion that this is so bad that we're going to abort it, and then has to wait for somebody else to.
yeah. And which is what the point I wanted to drive home was also, right, that you know I mean, of course, we may be better off than United States, but we were never, and we are not close to ideal at all. So in fact, like I mentioned earlier also, there is no right to abortion at your own choice. There is only a limited means to avail abortion in case certain legal conditions are met. So I just want to ask Shambhavi actually, so what do you think, like, is this desirable at all? I guess not.
So, is what exactly desirable?
The current situation where we don't have like a legal right to
No,
abort at
so
your choice.
no, I don't think it is
Yes.
desirable. I think having a legal right to abortion is it would be my ideal scenario. But I think just fixing the legal right is not going to be correct. I think what we also need is a lot of social change. And somehow for abortion, I think the social change needs to precede the legal change. And why I say that is because women need to be aware and have be able to have open conversations on abortions. We need to have the correct infrastructure set up for having abortions. We need families to be able to accept that women are going to undergo abortion. And I think only that social change can actually drive any right for seeking safe abortions, right? Otherwise, we are now left in the situation where we currently are, where we don't really understand how we can, there's a taboo of, I mean, forget about abortion, there's a taboo about reproductive health, there's taboo about talking about menstruation, for example. In that social context, just bringing in the legal change might not be sufficient. What I really liked about this judgment from that sense is that not the legality of what Justice Chandrachud has spoken about, but the fact that when you have, and I feel very sorry about saying this, but when you have a man of importance talk about these things, I hope it starts a lot more conversations. That is a sorry state of affairs, I think, for as a woman in India. But I genuinely hope that the thread gets picked up, right? And that can eventually drive social change. And it's quite unfortunate that I feel that a man has to start validating. This is something that I've seen quite often, right? That having that validation is really important. Being able to take that judgment across to people is going to be really important. So I think a legal right to abortion obviously makes sense, but it has to be a more ecosystem fix than just saying that we will change the law. Does that make sense, Shri?
Yeah, it does. And I think what can actually provide a testament to what you just mentioned is the fact that, in 2021, these significant amendments were carried out by the parliament,
Hmm.
right? That's a rather better way than like a court sort of deciding, what exactly should be the conditions for availing abortion. And the fact that the 12-week requirement was increased to 20 weeks to provide more leeway. I mean, of course, that's not sufficient or ideal as we would like it, but the fact that the parliament was alive to the reality that many more women are accessing abortion after that period, and they were all being forced to go to court, high courts or the supreme court, to get a judicial authorization for undergoing the
Right.
procedure, and that is avoidable, so they changed the law.
Yeah.
And similarly, I think one of the things that the amendment did was to, I think Harshit mentioned contraceptive failures earlier, right? The wording of the law was, you can avail termination of pregnancy if there is a contraceptive failure between the woman and her husband. Now the word husband was dropped and replaced with partner,
Yeah.
right? And I think these are good, important changes which actually came from the legislature rather than the judiciary. And in this aspect, I'm very happy.
Yeah.
The parliament is also making certain progressive steps, baby steps, but yeah,
Yeah,
steps
and I
in
think
that
that is how public policy should so look at making changes. Because I think a sudden change might also be like, oh my god, why are we suddenly changing all of this? I think gradual changes are easier to adapt to and live with. I mean, if consider this case, right? It's in Supreme Court because the High Court basically did not approve the woman's petition because, and I think somewhere in the judgment they even asked, why are you trying to kill this child without
Correct.
taking her stance into account, right? So I think it will take some time for society to change and adapt. And I think making gradual changes might make it more amenable than like a sudden shift. I mean, yeah.
I think in India also abortion is not such a hotly debated issue as maybe in the US or in certain countries. So we can wait for social change and then the sort of the legislation can follow. But for a lot of things, I think we'll have to go the other way and see it. So I really was sort of like, I found the statement so sad that I found it funny. Shambhavi, you said that you have to have a man of importance. You have to get validation from a man of importance to start a conversation. That is such a sad state of affairs for.
This is my opinion, but
I
this is
think
what I've seen. So, whatever I've seen of rural India, for example, I see that women still require that kind of patriarchal validation to feel that their opinions matter, right? To feel that they can make decisions. It is quite sad. I think that is also changing. Obviously, it's a social fabric that will require again time to change. And I think in that aspect, I found the judgment to be quite refreshing because it kept the woman at the center of the judgment. And I just wish that more of these things happen where women are kept central in, say, making judgments for itself, creating committees, making these kind of rules, that we have more women participants while these rules are being formed, and that we don't lose sight of why we are doing this. Let's try to put our faiths, our beliefs onto these rules. Right? So what I think what happens in the US, which is very different. And at the same time, like she said, we can't be lulled into this kind of confidence that hey, we are much better than the US because even if
yeah,
on paper it might, though far from ideal, better than US, on ground it has to be much better than what it is.
yeah, obviously.
The other strand I wanted to pick on, and I want to ask both of you as people with background in medical science, is that, why are doctors so hesitant about it? Of course, one side of it is the fact that there is a threat of criminal prosecution hanging over their necks, right? If in case something goes wrong, or if they run the risk of losing their medical license. And the other side is a lot of these social notions and conventions are also rooted in the minds of our doctors as well. And I think, like, I have a lot of female friends who hate going to the gyno because of the questions that they will be asked, right? And the kind of remarks they'll be made, the kind of looks they will be given. So I think there is a problem in that regard as well. So I just wanted to understand if there is any effort within the medical bodies, within medical associations, to sort of bring in a more forward-looking, progressive outlook.
Yeah, so there is a sort of a need to introduce some kind of sensitivity and sensibility sort of component into the MBBS curriculum. But yeah, so for OBGY, there are certain group of doctors in every city which run. For instance, in Bangalore also, there is a list of doctors which are very women friendly, which are trans friendly, which you can go for all your reproductive doubts and they'll help you out. So, but largely the doctors are basically people from the same society. They have the same biases and they have no, except the technical training part. Well, obviously, it's the technical training part. They have no like social sensitivity and sensibility training. So there's a movement which is arising from large cities, but large cities people already had better access than rural India. So, but it will take a long time. It's a long, drawn process. And if you ever go to a government labor room, you'll be shocked at the interaction between the patients and the residents or the doctors. So it's not a good treatment. But the treatment of the person, not the medical treatment. Medical treatment is all right, but the treatment of the person and treatment per se.
Yeah, I found this idea of having women friendly gynaec lists very ironical when I first came across this few months ago. But I think it's a response to something that is very real, like that women get judged even by their gynecologists because they're not adhering to a certain way of life that the gynecologist or the society at large might feel is necessary. As I said, I think this is an ecosystem problem, right? And just that's why I said that just having the legal right to abortion might not be enough unless all of these tiny cogs in the wheel also fit into place. We might not see much of a change. I think sensitivity, like Harshit said, makes a lot of sense. And I think just generally being able to respect the woman at the center of all of this is quite important. Being a mother, I can say that it is not an easy decision, to come and say that I want to abort a child that has been growing in me, I think, at any point of time. So I think if someone comes and says that, there must have been a lot of turmoil that has happened before. And so I think we should take that decision kind of seriously and try to understand where that person comes from rather than at that point of time judging and trying to be like, how, why, etc. And I think there's a broader obvious question of the fetus and what rights the fetus has, etc., which is being played out in the US, for example. And I think as a scientist, it's difficult to know, right? It's difficult to judge. Obviously, some of the arguments that were being made, for example, when the heartbeat rule was being discussed, is that, oh, you can see the heartbeat of the fetus at 8 weeks. So then it's a live baby and has its own rights. But I can very easily grow heart cells in a petri dish and they will beat. And you can look at them under a microscope and you will see a beating, the similar beating as you see in a sonograph. So if you tell me, please don't destroy any of the cardiomyocytes that people have and study for fundamental research, we're going to end up with a big problem. So some of that is not scientifically laid. And I think the question of ethics is a deeply personal one. So trying to figure out law around it is going to be very difficult and might not be the best way forward. Which is why I think that, again, education and including women in a lot of conversations, particularly around abortions, is necessary for us to have that kind of social recognition of the of what abortion is, what it means for the woman, what it means for the child, what it means for the family, has to be the way forward for India, at least.
Sure. So one more interesting thing that I found a few years ago. So in Chennai, you cannot get oral contraceptive pills. Tamil Nadu had some kind of a shadow ban in which the pharmacist and small hospitals didn't stock OCPs. So you had to drive to Pondicherry or go to some other place and you'll to get the pill there, or you know someone who knows someone who has gotten some when they went out of state and got it. So even in big cities, even basic OCPs are still an issue. I shudder to think if somebody wants to access abortions there. And unmarried female, I don't think you will be able to access. So for that, you need a very good list of female-friendly gynecologists. Yeah, that does sound like a irony, Shambhavi.
It,
That
it is.
does
It
sound
is.
like
I mean,
irony. Female-friendly gynecologist.
the amount of cover I have to take just to get sanitary pads from a chemist shop is, come on. He has to write a brown paper, black bag. If you're going to make reproductive health of women, this is so difficult to access. I mean, can you imagine abortion? I mean, so
Wise. I think it's very difficult being a woman in India.
it's generally difficult being a woman. It is more difficult being a pregnant woman, and it is even more difficult being a woman who has just delivered. Okay, I'm telling you this from personal experience because the minute you deliver, people forget about you, and there's the baby. Okay.
No, I think also, Shambhavi, just to add to what you said, of course, there's a debate about where life begins and, whether a bunch of cells beating on a petri dish can in fact be called life or not. But like you rightly pointed out, it is important to consider the social dimension of pregnancy, of having a child, of nurturing the child, bringing her up and all, and which I, of course, believe is women's choice, right? So a lot of debate over abortion overlooks this aspect, and it sort of just centers around, whether the fetus is alive, can we call it human, can we give it rights or not, but completely overlooking the social consequences of having a child.
Right.
I think in any society today.
Right. And particularly if you don't have state capacity, right? I mean, if there is a person who doesn't want a child and you're going to force that child on that person, can you imagine what kind of future that child has? I mean,
Yes.
why would you deliberately want to bring that onto that baby? Especially if there are like illnesses which the baby is going to suffer from. I really don't understand why the state thinks it needs to intervene. Not our state, obviously, but why the state feels it needs to intervene and force that illness
Stop. Yeah.
on the baby.
There's some research which shows that, for instance, in some US states, abortion was sort of like banned. It was very limited. So the poorer females who could not access abortions went and gave birth, and the children now had a lot of adverse outcomes. They were more poor, they were more sicker, and they had more criminal record. So you forced the female to bring a child into the world for which she was not ready, and she was not able to take care of it fully, and maybe she didn't want it. So the children also don't live very fulfilling and good lives.
I think in an India-specific context, what we need is better sex education, better access to contraceptives, better access to the morning pill, etc., and just more awareness, right, of women's rights. I think if we have that, the chances of someone wanting to do intentional abortion going to be low. If we keep everything as a taboo, if we don't want to talk about everything, then just expect that things will automatically magically get solved, that's not going to happen. So I think there's a lot of other things that we should as a society focus on doing, and that create a scenario where that legal right of abortion will make sense. It will be treated as a responsibility. It will not be treated only as a right.
Yeah.
I think, Shambhavi, you completely echoed Justice Chandrachud's words from the judgment. And, I'm, of course, a lawyer, so I thought like it's pertinent to mention that the Supreme Court at least is, again, cognizant of this. And it said that, reproductive rights should include the right to access education, information about contraception, sexual health, right to decide whether and what type of contraceptives to use, the right to choose and whether when to have children, the right to choose the number of children, the right to access safe and legal abortion, and the right to reproductive health care. And of course, women should have the autonomy to make these decisions free from coercion or violence, right? And it sounds fantastic on text, but
Yeah.
I think the thrust of the
Yeah.
conversation has also been there is a lot of social movement, social change necessary that will eventually drive us here.
Yeah.
Well put, Sri. So this podcast is now coming to an end. I think this was a very good discussion. And although the new judgment is very forward looking, there are on ground realities which will take some time to change. We can push for better access to abortions and better autonomy to women, better reproductive autonomy, but this will take some time. So Shambhavi and Sri, do you have any closing remarks?
No, Harshit, I think this was a good note to end on. Thank you. Thanks, Harshit.
Thank you, Harshit. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Shambhavi. Thank you, Sri.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.